and good morning, and welcome to BitThink with me, Christina. We're looking here at a chart of Bitcoin's price rise since it was just about $6,800. This morning, for sure, the whole space, whether it's here on YouTube or it's in mainstream regular financial press, everybody and everything seems to be aware of Bitcoin. I could swear my dog asked this morning, where can I buy some Bitcoin? I wanted to comment briefly this morning about some things that I'm seeing in terms of my framework of imagination and collective imaginations. There is obviously a great deal of fear being expressed by a great number of people, many of whom have been in this space and owners of Bitcoin for a very long time, participants in the market and in the culture for a very long time. And it's interesting to me to watch how people whose conviction of their imagination led them to purchase Bitcoin in the first place experience a moment of real fear as to whether or not their underlying convictions, their underlying belief structures, and the implications of those belief structures are actually correct. So on the one hand, I have been listening to a lot of the folks who have been teaching me a great deal express concerns that I resonate with. Oh crap, what happens if it turns out that all of the more fundamental things that we believe in actually turn out to be not believed by enough people to make them real? And I think that, just speaking for myself, sharing my own journey, one of the things that I find as I watch and I experience is that if I really do follow my own premises through, if I, having acknowledged that they are products of imagination, then go on to do the very human thing, which is to treat my beliefs as if they were facts, and then treat them as if they were scientific facts, and start translating them into the language of economics and markets and the nature of money and debt and institutions and the whole language that goes along with those beliefs, I have to sit back and relax, because many of the instruments that have been used to figure out what is happening in stock markets and bond markets and so on really don't apply in this scenario if you, the person who's having enough imagination to buy Bitcoin in the first place, follow through your own imagination. We're not dealing with a developed market. We are not dealing with a market that has any degree of saturation. And I think that if one is motivated by any of the sets of arguments, perceptions around broken trust systems, whether they be in government's capacity to pay back any of the unfunded obligations that have been clearly sitting there on the books for at least a generation. I remember learning that math when I was 20. Or debts that have to do with printing fiat money or any of the petrodollar analyses, or whatever angle you come to the space with some degree of anxiety about what the future of money, what the future of inflation or deflation is. I think it's important to recognize that once you have decided to believe enough in the collective beliefs of other people to buy Bitcoin, it's important to relax, because your beliefs will prove to have very powerful network effect if you remain within the collective construct of believing in Bitcoin. So I think that one of the things that people in the space, particularly in the YouTube space, are very aware of is how rapid the pace of increased adoption is, whether we measure that by Coinbase accounts or we know it anecdotally. I have a dear doctor friend here who asked me tentatively about how to buy Bitcoin, or it's Cryptoversity pointing out the British press this morning, which is highly mainstream, and for those who are very much looking for the reassurance of established authority to tell them what to do and what is safe. I think there's a real cognitive understanding about the narrative that people believe in, which is that if you increase the number of people who are trying to purchase something that is a scarce commodity, that is one of the most classic indicators of a price drive upwards. And since I think most of us are familiar with the visuals that represent the size of the cryptocurrency capitalization relative to other parts of the global economy, we all cognitively know that the premise of the beliefs that got us into Bitcoin in the first place are valid. If we look around at the products of all kinds of other collective belief systems, which would be, the trillion dollar derivatives exercise, right down to sovereign debt. So I think it's important that when people in the space, whether they're talking in terms of technical analysis and looking at things like, is it overbought? What's the moving day average? What are my Fibonacci's doing? I mean, I think that these things are useful, but they really do need to be retooled for an asset, an environment, and a whole kind of economic 3.0 experience that does not lend itself well to tools that are perhaps more appropriate to highly developed, if not sclerotic, if not highly manipulated, not by market participants. I think that is one of the things that many of the leading voices in the space kind of trip themselves up with, because the anxiety, understandable, again, I share the anxiety of, oh, well, what if this belief system that I'm really bought into, literally, emotionally, symbolically, and what if it turns out that not enough people believe, and they then start looking at what they think is going to happen in terms of a price expression using tools that don't measure the metrics that are actually driving the phenomenon we are experiencing and creating and participating in, and therefore continuing to create. I think this is the point at which I want to continue to make a very clear shout out to HuFin News, because I think that they have grasped the fact that while there are old style tools that can be transported, the ways in which we think about what we're seeing and what it means in those metrics, in those charts, is perhaps more honest and authentic in terms of what we know about how price discovery and buying and selling pressures operate in less manipulated and more transparent, if more raw, kind of 18th century style early capitalism, rather than the version of the analog markets we have now. So this chart, I think, or a version of this chart, has been pretty widely circulated. And of course, it's now a very well-established trope to compare Bitcoin to the tulip mania. And there are so many reasons why it's not an appropriate comparison. But one of the most obvious is that tulips, by definition, are things that have no longevity. So to discuss the kind of psychology that goes into effectively a type of futures market in a group of people who had, at that point, comparative to other Europeans, far too much money to know what to do with, given that they had a religious belief structure that did not approve of conspicuous consumption, certainly not overt conspicuous consumption. The whole exercise of betting on the futures of flowers is not appropriate comparison to something which is serving as a mechanism for transferring wealth from one set of denominators into another set of denominators. So when we discuss whether or not, or people become anxious about, or the whole language around bubbles as if it is a problematic expression of irrationality, the whole discourse itself is not particularly helpful, because part of what gets dismissed as irrational is precisely the kind of chosen and called into being imaginary structures, collective imaginary structures, which I am describing as another version of what we usually call facts or culture shifts or beliefs or discoveries or math or any of the other words that we use to describe how we all symbolically decide on what's real and what's not real. I think that it's not an appropriate conceptual tool to use. I think that one of the things that is interesting about the current Tether debate is that it may well be that Tether and other entities that find that they have to use second and third and fourth world banks in order to function may in fact be in a kind of reciprocal relationship where global banks, many of whom global banks who are holding dollar reserves, are filled with bankers who are people too, and they themselves may well be on a likewise mission to diversify their own U.S. dollar holdings. So there is an awful lot about the ways in which the ideas that have brought Bitcoin into being actually play out in ways that should, I think, make the community, at least the one that I'm listening to across the YouTube spectrum and in the press, just a little more confident and relaxed in the fact that the long-term prospects for Bitcoin, for cryptocurrency, are rock solid. Of course, there will be price variations, but it is one of the most reassuring and hopeful parts of the whole space is that price fluctuation means that the market can express waves of emotions, which are thoughts of the market participants in a pretty accurate way. And it is fair to say that whoever's fault it is, the traditional markets, the equity markets, the bond markets, have not been able to provide that variety of expression, and therefore have been trapped in much more dangerous one-way chart projections, whether it's in the price bonds or it's in the price of the shares generally on any of the indices. So I just wanted to put this out here as Bitcoin looks, 12 grand smack in the face, and just say that whatever one's strategy, whatever one's engagement from full-on hodl maximalism to day trading excitement in the stock market 3.0, and whatever other sets of variations, people who have believed enough to buy Bitcoin in the first place, have faith in your convictions, because it's the only way you can bring those convictions into being, is that every member of the network of collective imagination steadfastly hangs on to their imagination. So thanks for that, and I'll see you on the other side.